Hey guys, it's Courtney back from Wonder in English, and today I'm going to talk about a really fun topic for me that we learned about when I studied my master's in second language acquisition, which is how people learn languages. And that topic is how to teach English to your children, or maybe some of the facts that you should know and some of the misconceptions about what not to do. So I basically want to share with you all of the research that I have learned over the years. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that I've encountered with my students and with other people is that oftentimes they will want to teach English to their children. So this can come up in a lot of different scenarios. You could be a foreigner that moves to the United States and teaches your children English that way, and you want to preserve your first language. Or you could be living abroad and want to teach your kids English that way. So there are a few things that you need to keep in mind, a few facts that you should know. The very first one is that kids have a critical period at age 3. What that means is at age 3, everything changes in the brain. So up until this point, kids are actually sponges. They can absorb all the information from around them. So if you teach a kid different sounds from different languages, they will be able to recognize language patterns and different sounds in those languages up until age 3. So what this means is that age 3, they start to discard the ability or all the extra information that's in their brain and make everything more precise and honed in on the language that their brain plans on using. So if you've been exposed to English starting at the age of 6, you're never going to have quite the ear for English as you would have if you started listening to English at the age of 1 or 2. Because, for example, let's say that you started learning Spanish from 0 to 6 years old, and then at 6 you started to learn English in school. Well, your brain has already thrown out the ability to distinguish between all those really close English sounds. For example, V and B are very distinct sounds in English, but V and B are the same sound in Spanish. So that 6-year-old might really struggle to understand the difference between a V and a B. However, if they had started listening to English at 1 or 2, they would have no trouble distinguishing those sounds. So it's important to expose your children before the age of 3 to the language, mostly for pronunciation purposes. Because if they're not able to distinguish differences between sounds in their brain, they're not going to be able to produce the sounds with their mouth as accurately as a native speaker would later on. So pronunciation will never ever reach pure native-like accuracy if they don't learn it before the age of 3. And research has shown this. It's an unfortunate thing because people get very, very close to a native speaker, and most people think that they are a native speaker. But when run through rigorous exams, you can eventually see the breakdown between a native speaker and a non-native one. Not that that matters, because once you've reached that point where you're basically native, it doesn't really matter because everyday people won't notice. But what I'm trying to say is that they're much more likely to sound like a native speaker when they perceive and listen to the language before the age of 3. The second thing you guys should know is that bilingual children often underperform their peers in school, and that is okay. So oftentimes what will happen is a family will come from abroad, let's say from Mexico, and they will put their children in English-speaking schools in the US, and they will speak to their kids at home in Spanish. And then they will notice that their kids' grades start to drop, or they don't do so well compared to the other kids because they're using Spanish at home. Then they get worried and they stop using Spanish at home and only speak to them in English because they want them to be as good as their peers in English. I understand your concern, but it's actually not a concern at all. So what happens is it becomes very difficult for the child to learn both languages and use both of them at the same time, and they'll make a lot of mistakes, they'll use them interchangeably, and they might not do as well in their subjects at first. So by the time they reach high school, they will actually outperform their peers, and they will often even do better in other subjects that are not language related, because being bilingual is so good for your brain. So even though it's more challenging at first and it seems like they're not going to do so well, in the long run, they will do better than their peers in English and in other subjects. So don't worry about them. Keep teaching them Spanish or whatever your first language is, along with English. Sometimes we have two parents that speak different languages, and you want them to speak English with one parent and another language with another. And this is a really great technique. So for example, I'm an English speaker. If I married a Spanish speaker, then we could do the one parent, one language technique, where I speak to the child in English and my husband speaks to the child in Spanish. That way the kid will know how to separate the languages and will get to practice it equally with each parent. They will also get to hear the language used natively in each parent's way. So it's a really great tool in order to teach your kids two languages. A lot of parents that do come here from abroad to the United States tend to be fearful and not want to use their first language. They want their kids to acclimate and become more American or more used to this culture and really, really good at English. And I understand why socially they would want to do that. However, something that normally tends to happen is they will reject their first language, and then the kids will reject it as well. Sometimes the parents are proud of their first language and the kids still reject learning the parents' first language. Why is that? Because they're going to school with a bunch of kids that are speaking English. So to a young kid whose brain is not developed, whose social awareness is not fully developed, is so terrified of being different, of standing out, that they don't want to speak that first language of their parents. They want to speak in English. So my recommendation to you would be to enforce this and make them speak to you in your first language. Don't just have them listen to you and respond in English, because then they will actually never fully develop their skills in that language, whatever your first language is, and they will regret it later. I have seen this so many times with friends, with people I know, whose parents speak Spanish or another language, and they can understand everything, but they can't quite respond. Or they do respond, but they're missing a ton of vocabulary and missing the confidence. And they regret that when they're older and they're looking for a job, and it's so good to be bilingual, but they're not truly bilingual because they can understand but not produce the language. So I would enforce using the language that you speak in the household. What if you want to teach your kids English and you don't speak that language? Well, I would suggest hiring a nanny who does. An au pair or a nanny can come take care of your kids and speak with them throughout the day so that they become accustomed to hearing that language. As I said earlier, kids are like sponges. They're going to absorb all of that information. So even though it's not coming from you, they will learn it, even just from a little bit of exposure each day. If you think that you could just put on the TV in English and get away with it, I'm sorry, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. They've done research studies where they put kids in front of the TV and taught them with puppets in Japanese. And then they gave some kids nannies who spoke Japanese. Well, guess who actually learned the language? Only the kids with the nannies and the human being in front of them. So there's something about human beings that creates a language learning environment that the TV simply just does not produce. The last tip is really good news, and that's if you don't use it, you actually won't lose it. And this is the case for pronunciation and understanding different sounds. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, up until age 3, you can distinguish all sounds from all languages as easily as anyone else. But then at age 3, that stops and you're only able to distinguish the sounds within your own language. So if you're around that other language, if you're around English before the age of 3, and then you're around it from ages 1 to 7, and then you stop learning English completely and you move to another country and you never use English again, you will still have the ability to distinguish those sounds better than somebody who has never perceived the language before. So even though maybe you were only 5, 6, 7 years old when you stopped learning English, your brain still retains some of that syntactic structure that helps it know the difference between those sounds. So you'll have a little bit of a leg up on people who don't know the language at all. You won't be completely fluent, but you'll definitely understand the sounds a lot better than somebody who hasn't experienced that at a very young age, like you did. Okay, I hope that this was helpful for you guys. If you have any questions at all about teaching kids English or about how any of this works, please leave a comment below. I would love to hear from you guys and answer all of your questions. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And most importantly, hit that notification bell, because then you guys can get lessons and important information like this every single week on your YouTube page. So thank you guys so much for staying tuned. I'll see you next week. Bye!